I'm just trying to imagine Susan floating in the. I want to see those pictures.
Okay.
No matter how bad a swimmer you are, that would be the one place. It'd be pretty hard to drown there. Right. Chapter 9 of the Gospel of John tells us the story of the man who had been blind since birth. You need to read that whole chapter. It's a long story. I didn't have us read the whole chapter today, but it's an exciting story, ins and outs, lots of drama, lots of subtlety and different characters in it. I hope you'll read it. Pay attention. Our passage that was read is kind of a summary of that, and also where I'm going with this sermon. Jesus and the disciples are walking by, and the disciples decide to ask Jesus. They're walking by a blind man. And they decide to ask Jesus why this person was the way he was. Was it his sins or his parents' sins that caused his blindness? Particularly in that period of time, anything bad, physically, and sometimes in terms of activities that occurred, were often based upon the idea, their understanding, or the theological debate was on the idea, well, there must have been something bad in that person's life that caused that. Now, we don't always, although some of us almost lean over into that, but usually we don't say it quite like that. Usually we say, must have been their fault. They're on welfare. They must be lazy. We just project and blame. Well, they had their blame game too. Only they pulled God into it. And Jesus hears the disciples asking that question. I'm sure the disciples heard all kinds of debates about those kinds of questions. Ignoring the disciples' desire for a theological dialogue, Jesus answers neither and proceeds to address the needs of the man before him rather than view the man as a theoretical problem. When you look at your newspaper, magazines, or watch your media, or watch television, you will hear people debate theories and not theological, although sometimes theological, but they will debate levels of sinfulness, causal factors. And Jesus is saying, focus on the person. Is this his sins, or is this his parents' sins that have brought him to this state? And Jesus says neither. And then he focuses on the man. He focuses on the needs that are before him rather than view him again as a theoretical problem. He informs them that God is simply using this man as an opportunity to display the Lord's wondrous work, and that time is running out, he says, inferring that they need to be about the business of making flesh the wondrous works of God, telling and showing the love of God, rather than flapping their lips in theological debates. The time is short, he says. The time is short. And the debates go back to the previous generations and the generations before that and the generations before that. So obviously we're not coming up with good answers. But Jesus focuses on the person before him and reminds them that time is short. So when the church argues and debates about human sexuality, rather than loving people no matter what their situation is, we are debating theologically and flapping our lips. But are we loving the people, whomever they are, including the ones who oppose them, as well as the ones who are? Church is split over, breaks the heart of God. But Jesus says to his disciples, neither. He says, time is short. As Jesus informs them that his purpose is to be light in the world in order to truly give sight to people. He bends over, he picks up a handful of dirt, he spits in it, and applies this medicinal mud pack to the blind man's eyes. And this was the traditional medical treatment of that time. He's got these mud packs, and he begins to apply on the blind man's eyes. He then informs them to go and wash it off at the pool of Siloam. And the blind man proceeds to wash off the mud at the pool. And for the first time in his whole life, he can see. Now, Jesus could have entered into long theological debates with his followers. And we can enter into long theological debates with each other. We can argue the pros, we can argue the cons, we can argue whether something is too liberal, whether something is too conservative. We can go back and forth. But when Jesus walks along and the disciples invite him into an opportunity for debate, a theological problem about issues of responsibility and sin, etc., Jesus says, neither. Look at the person before you. Look at the person before you. He kept forcing us away from our theories. He kept forcing us back to human beings who are right there before us. Instead, when Jesus heals this man, who wondrously now sees, this blind man who'd been blind for so many years, he's now seeing. Instead of a wonderful celebration and should be breaking out in the community, it ends up sounding more like a skeptics convention. Read chapter 9 of John. The neighbors can't believe it. Though some finally come to believe what has happened, others doubt that this is even the same person. After making what happened, he tells them how Jesus put clay on his eyes and had him wash off in the pool of Siloam. And they ask, where this Jesus is, and he tells them he doesn't know. Actually, he doesn't even know what he looks like. He was blind, remember? And the man's neighbors finally figure it all out, that this just might have something to do with God. So they take him to the religious leaders. Apparently, this was a mistake. Sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes not so good when you take him to religious leaders. By the way, all this had happened on the Sabbath, the holy day that had become more and more piled up with regulations and laws about what you could do on the Sabbath and what you couldn't do on the Sabbath. And that gift which God had given, even in Genesis very clearly, that was supposed to be a gift to us, now became a burden for many. The Pharisees proceed to grill the previously blind man, whom they find out what had happened. And they inform the man that Jesus is obviously not of God because he performed this so-called healing on the Sabbath. I mean, he could have said, I'll get back to you tomorrow. It's Sunday. Well, for them, it would be Saturday. And he could have done that. I mean, really, he could have done that. But he didn't. And he didn't do it because the immediacy of the person's need before him was what he responded to and cared for. Other religious leaders argued, how could a sinner perform such signs from God? So they ended up arguing among themselves. When they asked the man what he thought, he told them that this Jesus was probably a prophet. That's not what they wanted to hear. And they then proceed to find his parents. The man who was healed, let's check out his parents to verify whether or not the man really had been blind from birth. And one of the questions they asked them is to give an explanation for what had happened to their son. These parents were old enough and wise enough to realize what was going on. They knew the religious leaders were fishing for a reason to denounce this Jesus. And they had the power to excommunicate them from the temple if they said the wrong thing. But how could they say anything bad about someone who had just given their blind son sight? So they ended up saying that they didn't know how this happened and that their son was old enough to answer for himself. Smart move. And at this point, the religious leaders end up dragging that son back before them, and again, for another grilling. And the Pharisees tell him, give glory to God. This man, it's Jesus, is a sinner. And then the man answers, and this is our text that was read earlier. Whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I do know. I was blind, and now I see. That's a hard testimony to argue with. I don't have all the theological answers. I can't explain it all. I don't understand it all. I don't understand it all in the Bible. I don't understand it all in terms of what's going on in the world today. But here is what I can say. This is where I was, and now because of Jesus, this is where I am. The story goes on. They continue grilling him and end up throwing him out of the temple. And Jesus finds out, and he goes to him. And the man ends up really seeing who Jesus is. The Christ, the Messiah, and ends up worshiping him. And the story ends with commentary from Jesus about the fact that those who think they see may be the blindest of all. Those who think they have it all together spiritually may in actuality be full of sin. But those who know their blindness, have the possibility of sight. This blind man who had gained his sight witnessed to those about him in a simple manner. I don't know. The one thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. So in this time of Lent, we are reminded of the one whom we're called to follow, the one who healed, who loved, who reached out to all the outcasts, even the enemies of the people, who reached out to those who were beyond the pale, and he loved them. And he told them the good news of who the Father was, God's wonderful grace that just won't quit. Not even for the worst of sinners. And strangely enough, the ones who are the worst sinners have the most possibility and chance of finding the grace of God. When we try to witness, we need to remember something. We have a good news to share because we know Jesus Christ. If we know Christ personally, if you know and have a living relationship with God through what you have seen in Jesus Christ, then you know the presence and existence of God personally. And the call is to be a witness. Now, a witness is not somebody who shares out of a formula. Well, preacher, I haven't been to the seminary. I haven't yet been there, so I don't know all the answers, and I don't have all the solutions and such. You don't have to. You don't have to be a lawyer for Jesus. That's not what Jesus calls you to. You're called to be a witness to your own story, a witness to where God has brought you, what you have experienced. In other words, you are to tell people where God has blessed you, and you're to tell people where you're still along the journey. I'm not there yet. I'm still trying to figure out how to be faithful to this Jesus I'm trying to follow. There are times where I mess up terrible. And you need to tell that to the people that you want to be a witness to. Because otherwise they won't believe you when your story always sounds like you just must be an angel falling from heaven. When you look in the mirror, you know the other side of that story. So being a witness has to do with sharing with folks the good news that you believe and have found who God is. And God is so wonderful, and the one whom I have experienced that shows me how wonderful God is Jesus. I really believe that's what God is like. And because of that, now I relate differently. It means that I'll take the time to listen to someone. There are people in here I know who are a witness because they take the time to listen to someone who's hurt. And because they spent the time to listen to that someone who is hurting, they're able to share the one who feels their loneliness or their pain and their hurt. Some of you have been leaders in sharing financially and being able to help out other people. And you said, this is all gift, I realize now, because of God's relationship with me. Everything I have, the ground I walk on, everything I have is God's. So I have to find a redemptive way to share it with others because of what I've seen in Jesus, who's reminded me that time is short. I'm not taking it with me anyway. Some of you have been in conversations sometimes with people who don't have all the theological answers, or they're asking a lot of tough theological questions sometimes, and you don't have the answer. And sometimes all you need to do is listen and say, that is a hard question, and I'm not sure I have all the answers to that. But here is what I do know. Here is what I have experienced. And here is why I believe it from this that has happened in my life. So when you're called to the witness stand, you're not called there to stand to be a lawyer for God. You're called to tell your story as to what God has been doing for you and through you in your life. Humbly, because you've got to remember to tell the other part. I'm still in the process. Every day, God has to forgive me of my sins. Every day, I have to learn to walk humbly and trust God. And sometimes I don't. And when I don't, I feel it. I'm miserable. But when I do, things happen. I really begin to feel the presence of God. I find peace. I don't have all the answers. Maybe I can take to somebody who can answer some of those questions. But in the end, all I can tell you is I can be a witness to what I have experienced. That's what you'll be saying. But that's what an authentic witness is. And as the man says, whether he is a sinner, I do not know. Whether Jesus is exactly who everybody says and claims, and whether I understand the concept of the Trinity, whether I understand how he can be a man in the presence of God at the same time, whether we understand all this, I do not know. One thing I do know, before I was blind, but now I see. You're not called to have all the answers, and neither am I. But what you are called to is to tell your story of what God has been doing in your life. And everything you and I know about God that really counts is what we have seen in the face of Jesus. That's our hope, and that's how we live in faith. We'll have to figure out a lot of things along the way, but in the meantime, God will bless us on that journey. God will watch over us, and God will give us opportunities to be a witness. I don't mean giving out formulas, but I mean telling your story. Because that's what people really want to hear. Where God has been real in your life. Don't have to have all the answers. I don't know everything. But let me tell you what I do know. Here's what I do know. Here's what has made a difference in my life. And I share it with you. That's a position of humility. And people who know you're authentic will listen.